All right, guys, welcome to Chapter 4, Section 1. Here we go. This one is about what is biodiversity and why is it important. Biodiversity is a word we use all the time in ecology and environmental science, but it's sometimes hard to describe exactly what it is. So that's what we're going to work on today. All right, guys, this slide is an overview of the whole chapter. And the part at top without a bullet, it says, Chapter 4 touches on how biodiversity is found in genes, in species, in ecosystems, and in ecosystem processes. Do you see that? There's four because there's four types of biodiversity. And then the bullets go over the basics of each section in this chapter. Section 1, which we're working on now, every species plays a specific ecological role called its niche in the ecosystem where it's found. Section 2 is going to talk about environmental changes and the genetics, how they mutate, and some of the genetic traits that enhance the abilities to survive. And then the third bullet down here at the bottom is going to talk about speciation and extinction. And so that's the basic overview of how this chapter is set up. So section 1 starts off, the chapter starts off with a case study about amphibians. And amphibians are really, really important because they are an indicator species. I don't know how much you know about frogs, but frogs, their skin has to stay wet all the time, and they can actually breathe through their skin. Both of those things, the fact that the skin has to stay wet and they can breathe through their skin, means they are very, very, very sensitive to pollution. And so what we do is we use the frogs to let the ecologists know how healthy a particular ecosystem is. If you're in an ecosystem and there are frogs everywhere, and amphibians, meaning lizards, and frogs and salamanders both, not just frogs, but frogs and salamanders and toads to a certain extent. But if you go to an ecosystem and they are everywhere, then you have a really, really healthy ecosystem. If you go around and there used to be frogs, but now they're all gone, something's happening. Something happened to your ecosystem because they are so sensitive. So we call them an indicator species. Frogs are an indicator species. And that's kind of what it's talking about here within our case study and the Explorers at Work, these first two articles in the chapter. Now we get on into the chapter. Again, here's the three basic keys of what we're going to be learning here. Describe the four components of biodiversity. I just told you there's four parts. So you'll need to know and list the four parts. And this one says, explain how biodiversity leads to more resilient ecosystem. Resilient means it can bounce back if something bad happens. All right, so we're going to talk about that too. And then understand how biodiversity relates to our natural capital. Remember that all of the things that the earth does for us, it's almost like our paycheck, right? And so the healthier the earth is, the bigger our paycheck can be, the more we can use what we have here for the earth, which is why we got to take care of it. But that's our paycheck. That's the earth taking care of us. So the biodiversity helps to give us more natural capital. And then, of course, we have our different vocabulary words that we'll be using throughout this section. All right. And so moving on. Okay, so biological diversity or biodiversity is the variety of the Earth species. That's the first one. The genetic material in which they contain, the ecosystems in which they live, and then ecosystem processes like energy flow and nutrient cycling. It's one of the three scientific factors of sustainability. Do you remember learning that in the very beginning in Chapter 1? The scientific factors of sustainability. Biodiversity is one of those. In one form or other, life is everywhere, okay? There is no place on the earth that you can't find something living there. And so it's virtually everywhere on Earth, from seemingly barren glaciers out to the deserts, also barren, the colorful coral reefs and lush rainforests. So from one extreme to the other, okay, where you almost find none at all into you find so many, life is everywhere. Biodiversity or biological diversity is the variety of life on Earth. There is a simple, real, easy explanation for you to help remember. Okay, biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. But variety comes in more than one way. We have a variety of species. We have a variety of genetics. We have a variety of ecosystems. And we have a variety of ecosystem processes. And again, sorry my face is in front of this, but you saw it when you did your notes for the regular thing. So here's our list. Okay, biodiversity is one of the three factors, and biodiversity means the variety of life. Okay, we have a variety of species, we have variety in our genetics, we have variety in our ecosystems, and we have variety in the functions that each animal carries on. That's the niche we're talking about. We'll get there in a minute. Niche. Okay. Now, the first one is species diversity. That's the most common one. When we talk about diversity, we think about, yeah, this place has giraffes and zebras and wildebeests and lions and hyenas and acacia trees, don't forget the plants, and grasses and mosquitoes and ants, all this thing. So that means species diversity. That's the most common one when we think about biodiversity. We most commonly think of species diversity. It describes both the variety of species, the different kinds, like I just listed, giraffes, lions, zebras. Those are the variety of species, but also the abundance of the species in that ecosystem. Have you ever seen wildebeest herd? They're huge. Okay, that's the abundance, how many of them there are. So how many different kinds of animals and how many of each kind. The variety and the abundance of species in the ecosystem. To date, we have about 2 million types of organisms on Earth that we know of. 2 million. And there's probably a lot more that we haven't discovered yet. And so we think it's maybe closer to 7 to 10 million if we can finish discovering them before we drive them all extinct. And this is what I was talking about, that picture here. The species diversity. You have giraffes, you have wildebeest, you have zebras, you have 3 or 4 different bird species, 2 or 3 different kinds of grasses. Off in the distance you have some lions and some impalas. So this is the species diversity. Those are the different variety of species. Now if we think of abundance, the most abundant species in this picture is the wildebeest, right? There's just that one giraffe. Abundance means how many there are, and variety means how many different kinds. But all of these go together for species diversity. All right, next one. In one form or another, life exists everywhere. We talked about that. So we want to look closely at this picture in your book, okay? And we can read the caption. I think you might have a worksheet that goes over these questions. All right, so how many different species do you see at the watering hole? There's about 6 or 7 of them. And the purpose of what is the purpose of this graphic, and how does it relate to our knowledge in terms of biodiversity? This graphic is designed to show you how much biodiversity you can have in a single shot, one picture. Okay, we have another thing that does something similar with the coral reefs we'll get to in just a second. Okay, the idea of biodiversity is how much can you see in one picture. And so when we see a lot like that, that is a very strong ecosystem. When you don't see as much, the ecosystem is a little weaker. The second type of biodiversity is genetic diversity. Okay, and these are the genes within a species. The second component of biodiversity is genetic diversity, which is the variety of genes within a single population or within a species. Now remember, the difference here, population is a whole bunch of the same animals in the same area. Species is the same animal anywhere on Earth. So their species and population are sort of the same, but sort of different. In both of them, we're talking about a single type of animal or plant, a single type of organism. A population means that single type of organism living together nearby one another. Species means that single type of organism anywhere on the Earth. But the genetic diversity, what it means is that the genes, of course, they contain the instructions or codes and the genetic information to give rise to traits and characteristics. These traits then are going to be passed on down through reproduction. If they happen to be useful, you learned natural selection, and we'll go over a little bit more of natural selection a little later, but you've learned about it. If the traits are useful, the species is going to flourish. If the traits come off bad, then that particular organism is probably going to die. If the traits that they inherit are bad, that organism will die and not transfer that trait down to their children. They'll die before they have children. That's one of the ways that the ecosystem keeps the animal suited. Okay, if you have a gene that works out for you, you will survive, and you will survive better. If you have a gene that doesn't work, most likely something is going to eat you for lunch before you have a chance to pass that bad gene on to a child. So the variations within the genes, okay, going to contribute to genetic diversity. These are Cuban land snails. They are all the same species. Look at all those different colors that are possible. Okay, this is what I mean by genetic diversity. There are a lot of different genes. Now, one of the things we talk about with natural selection when we're thinking this through is, let's say, what if you found a bunch of these snails on sandy reddish dirt? Okay, then the red ones are going to hide better and they'll live longer and there'll be more red ones in the population. What if they're living around concrete and granite rocks? Well, then the gray ones are going to do better than the orange ones. But the simple fact that they have all of these choices within their genetics means that the species as a whole is going to survive better regardless of what the ecosystem does. This is what we're talking about. If the ecosystem changes, how likely is your species to survive? That's the key. The ecosystems are not always going to stay the same. So if you have a lot of genetic diversity, the ecosystem does some changing and switching. Somewhere in your genes is something that's going to work. And that's the whole key. All right, so the species have a better chance of surviving and adapting to environmental changes if they have a greater diversity. Somewhere in that genetic pool is something that matches the new ecosystem. Every time the ecosystem changes, there should be something that matches and does well. And if not, then that thing's going to be extinct. So there's a greater chance individuals going to possess favorable traits if you have a large genetic diversity to pull from. Like resistance to diseases even. It's not just camouflage. It's not always camouflage, but that's usually one of the easiest things to see. But resistance to disease is also part of genetics. The third component of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. All right, so we have lots of different types of ecosystems within the Earth. The Earth's diversity of biological community, like deserts and grasslands and forests and lakes and rivers and wetlands. We have tons of different types of ecosystems so that the different animals can be in whichever type of ecosystem they fit. When we start turning everything into a parking lot, we lose all of this ecosystem diversity, and the animals all have to struggle to find a place to be. So the number of ecosystems can be represented in larger groups called biomes. Okay, so ecosystem is a more small term, biome is a larger term. And they're characterized by having a certain type of vegetation, plants. The biomes are determined by the plant life. All right, so certain plants need this amount of sunlight and this amount of rain to live there. Okay, so with however much sunlight and however much rain and temperature, okay, will determine what kind of plant lives there. And then once you've determined the type of plant, then the animals will make do. So the plants determine the biome. Plants determine the biome. So whatever kind of sunlight and temperature and rainwater will determine what plant you have. And once you know what plant you have, that determines the animals that will live there. This is a slice, still talking about ecosystem diversity, okay? We're still talking about ecosystem diversity. This is a slice of the United States. All right, over here on this side, we have the Pacific Ocean. Do you see that San Francisco right there? And over here, we have the Atlantic Ocean. All right, and that's Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, so New York and stuff is over here on this side. But if you look, this is just a slice cut out of the U.S. Across the middle. We have chaparrals, which is, it's like desert scrubland. We have coniferous forests. We have deserts. We have more coniferous forests. We have prairies and grasslands. And then this part that's under my picture here is temperate forests and woodlands. All right. All of these different types of ecosystem are found in one area of the U.S. So that means that we have a whole lot of ecosystem diversity and different places where the animals can live and find good habitats. However, if we start turning the whole thing into a parking lot, all right, there's not that much for the animals left. Okay. The last component is called functional diversity. Now that one's a little bit newer. Most of the other ones you could kind of figure out. Functional diversity is something kind of new. It's the fourth component of biodiversity, the fourth type of biodiversity. Let's go through the types. The first one was species diversity. The second one was genetic diversity. The third one is ecosystem diversity. And here's the fourth one, functional diversity. Now what that means is it's a variety of processes like energy flow and matter cycling that occurs within the ecosystem. This is the stuff we learned about in last chapter. Do you recognize this picture? We learned about this stuff, energy flow and matter cycling, in last chapter, and that is actually part of the fourth component of biodiversity. It generally concerns the variety of ecological roles that the organisms play, like the producers and consumers. Remember learning? This is what we're talking about. And the impact that their roles have on the overall ecosystem. So what we learned in section 3 or chapter 3 is going to be a big part of what is the fourth biodiversity, functional biodiversity. And the examples of things that functional diversity means is, first, where does the organism fit in the food chain or web? What is its feeding strategy, meaning herbivore, carnivore? And how does this behavior affect the chemical and physical conditions of the environment? Now that's a little weird, but that's sort of like when beavers chop down trees, right? So how does it affect their physical environment? Every animal, beavers are really strong example of an animal affecting its environment, but even on small scales, the animals affect their environment. So these three things are the examples of functional diversity, which is the fourth element of biodiversity, the fourth type of biodiversity. Now, more than one, the reason we get into this is that more than one species can share the same function. We have many different types of herbivores. Okay, many different animals that feed on bugs. Many different animals that do a whole bunch of different things. So what they do at first is they share, right? Two animals that are grazers will share the same feeding strategy. If something happens within the ecosystem that knocks, maybe there's a sickness that comes in and kills off one of the herbivores, the other herbivore will pick up the slack. That's why we need functional diversity. We need a whole bunch of organisms that do the same job. Because if something happens to one, the ecosystem will be resilient. The ecosystem can bounce back. The ecosystem can maintain its health, okay, overall. Even if we lose one species, overall the ecosystem will be fine if we have enough functional diversity that whatever job, the one that went extinct or started dying off, whatever job they had, somebody else can pick up the slack. Okay, that's why we need functional diversity, to keep the ecosystems healthy. So if it contains many species that share functional traits, the ecosystem will be better able to withstand some species loss without losing functionality. Like I said, one can pick up the slack for the others. However, if in that ecosystem you only have a few species with different traits, then losing one is going to have a much stronger impact on functionality of the ecosystem. You're more likely to tank the whole ecosystem if you only have a few that are doing each job. Okay, so if you have a whole bunch doing the same job and something bad happens, the ecosystem can bounce back. But if you only have one or two that do this job, something happens, the whole ecosystem can get tanked. So the questions here, how does biodiversity relate to the ecosystem, relate to stability? Like I said, if something happens with some animal starts to die off, and if you have good functional diversity, the ecosystem will be more stable. If something dies off, then the whole ecosystem could become unstable and stuff could happen. So the more biologically diverse the ecosystems are, the more productive they will be. That will help you answer this question right here. And with a greater variety of producer species, plants, with a greater variety of producer species, an ecosystem will produce more plant biomass, which in turn will support greater variety of consumer species. We almost always think, and I've been doing it while I was talking, think just in the terms of the animals. Don't forget the plants. If you have a lot of different plant species, then you'll be able to support that many more different types of herbivores, which will be able to support that many different types of carnivores and omnivores. The more plant species you have, the stronger your ecosystem will be. Like I just said with biomes, plant is king. Plant is king. It's the same thing with biodiversity. Plant is king. The more different plants you have, the more that you can support that whole ecosystem. And then the more biologically diverse the ecosystem it is, the more stable it will be. Now, this brings us into something that I know is new. I can almost guarantee, I mean, you guys have heard of insurance. I know most of you guys have heard of insurance. You're driving and stuff is crappy and you're paying for your insurance, or your folks are paying for it, or hopefully somebody's paying for it. But when we're talking about ecology, the insurance hypothesis, all right, it's what it means is, as I said, the more biologically diverse your ecosystem is, the stronger it will be if something bad happens. This is insurance. This is insurance, okay? The biodiversity, here we go. The more biodiverse something is, biodiversity is going to ensure that ecosystems help stand against decline in their functioning, because many species provide greater guarantees of functioning even if others fail. Now, this is a long, complicated way to say it, but what I just said is if you have somebody to take up the slack, the ecosystem would be safer and more stable. This is what we're talking about. Biodiversity ensures that if you have something bad happen, the ecosystem as a whole will be just fine. Okay, the insurance hypothesis, that's the whole reason you have health insurance, right? And car insurance. If something bad happens, you have insurance, theoretically, okay? You're not going to go bankrupt. Whether it's health insurance or car insurance, if something bad happens, the insurance is designed to keep you from going bankrupt. Same thing with the biodiversity. The more biodiversity you have, it will keep the if something bad happens, keep the ecosystem from failing. This is the insurance hypothesis. Biodiversity is insurance for the ecosystem. The ecosystems are biologically diverse, are more likely to include species with traits that enable them to adapt to changes. Like I said, the ecosystems don't stay the same. You've got to be able to flow with the punches. Okay, so if you have the stronger ecosystems include species with traits that enable them to adapt to changes in the environment, like disease or drought. And such species will help an ecosystem develop more resilience, even if some of the species are lost. Now, you know what resilience means, right? Bouncing back. Bouncing back. So if something bad happens, the more biodiversity you have, the easier it is for you to bounce back. This term resilience you're going to see several times. Resilient means ability to bounce back after something bad happens. Here's some example here. Now, what we have in this picture is the green ones. We don't even know what this is. This green whatever likes hot. Yeah? Yeah. The green ones like hot and the blue ones like cold. So in a good diverse community, okay, when you have them about balanced, okay, this is a good balanced community. Okay, this year it turned out to be hot. Okay, so the green ones are good. They like it hot. All right. But the blue ones almost died out. In this diverse ecosystem, yes, there's more green ones than blue ones, but the ecosystem as a whole is fine. Here's a cold year. Okay, the cold ones love it. The green ones, not so much. They're dying off. However, in the full diverse community, yes, there's more blue than green, but the ecosystem as a whole is okay. This is what we're talking about. It's the ecosystem as a whole. If you have more different species together, then if something bad happens to one, somebody else can pull up the slack. Okay, that's the insurance hypothesis. Somebody else can pull up slack. So think about this. This is some questions, and I'm pretty sure this is on a worksheet as well. If every business in town tried to sell air conditioners, okay, and summer clothes and pool equipment, what would happen to the economy of the town when it got wintertime? All right, so the whole economy of the town would be bad. What if there were many different businesses, and some that sold summer and some that sold winter and all that stuff, others that sold groceries? Well, then that's a good thing, right? The community as a whole will prosper. So how does this relate back to biodiversity? If you have a whole bunch of different species doing a whole bunch of different jobs, things are going to be better more often of the time. If you just have one or two things doing one or two jobs, something bad happens with the ecosystem, you might just tank the whole ecosystem. Now this brings us to the next part. Having all this biodiversity is going to build natural capital. Remember, we said natural capital is the paycheck Mother Nature gives us. These are the services she performs for us. These are the things that Mother Nature does to help keep us safe and keep us happy. That's what natural capital is. And the more biodiversity we have, the better Mother Nature can give us stuff. And I know that sounds greedy, but that's how it works. Okay, so biodiversity is vital to maintaining the natural capital that helps keep humans alive and supports their economies. Humans are part of the ecosystem, so biodiversity helps build the natural capital. Yes, all of the animals will benefit. Humans are one of the animals that benefit. When we have the giant, good, awesome biodiversity, we have great biodiversity, the whole ecosystem will profit, humans included. So with the aid of our technology, the humans can tap into the Earth's biodiversity to help with resources like food, medicine, building materials, fuel. Okay, this is some of the natural capital that she gives us. Okay, I'm trying to make an arrow. That is a really bad looking arrow. Okay, but these are some of the natural capital things that the Earth can give to us. So this picture here, we've got stocks, that's natural capital, biodiversity, that's natural capital. It flows here into the ecosystem and abiotic services. Okay, these are the services she provides, and under my head is the value, the benefits to society. This is farming and agriculture and medicine. Okay, these are all the things that she does for us. So biodiversity is going to support the natural ecosystem services. That was the third box in the one we just saw. Okay, so it supports the natural ecosystem services like air and water purification. The more biodiverse the community is, the better these processes happen. This is what I'm talking about. The better biodiversity we have, the better these processes work. Air and water purification, renewal of topsoil, decomposition of waste, and pollination. Okay, pollination. With the whole scare of the bees disappearing, I don't know where that stands right now in the news, but if we don't have bees and insects to pollinate, we have no food to feed ourselves. You need pollination to have the plants to grow right. So these natural services would be extremely difficult to replicate if they cease to exist. Humans try and try and try to do this stuff, but we can't. Mother Nature needs to be able to do this for us. And the only way Mother Nature can do this for us is if we maintain the biodiversity. That's the whole point. Mother Nature will do this stuff for us. We can't do it well enough on our own. And she will do it if we keep the biodiversity up. So the Earth's variety of genetic information, species, and ecosystems, those are the first three types, will also provide raw materials for the evolution of new species, okay, and ecosystem services as the species respond to changes in environmental conditions. We know that the environment is changing very rapidly. It is our fault. 85%, 95% of it is our fault that the environment is changing so fast. And if we have enough biodiversity, the animals can adapt to it quickly enough and then continue to provide these services we need, only if there's enough biodiversity. So this graphic here shows us some of the ecosystem services that the Earth provides for us, and you're going to need to know, like these four. There are supporting services, like this is crazy. Okay, like nutrient cycling, that's the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles, photosynthesis, soil formation, and water cycling. Then regulating processes she does for us, okay, is the water and air purification, pollination, temperature control, flood control, climate moderation. There's provisioning that the Earth does for us, giving us food and fibers for clothes, and medicine and timber for building and other products. Then there's the cultural things that ecosystem provides for us, and that's relaxation and health and just having a good time in nature. And the balance, of course, is essential for that. So using up too many of them is going to lead to loss of the regulating and supporting and all of these functions that the Earth does for us. Here's another way to look at it. This is hard to read, but these are the same four: the supporting, culture, provisioning, and regulating. These are the same four that were just up in the top of the tree, and it goes over the details. I couldn't make it any clearer. I was trying to make this clearer for you. But when they ask you to show and list some of each one, that's this graphic that you're going to be using. And I think that might be, yeah, so how do humans make use of biodiversity resources? This is the protected lands, land management. We have invasive species that we need to do. The biodiversity conservation helps us with all of these things. Pollution. We also have genetic diversity, public health. These are all the things that biodiversity can give to us and help us get through. And I think that is the end of section 1, chapter 4. So I will see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.